If I had to describe Detention in a simple sentence, imagine an alternate universe where Team Silent, the people who made the original 4 Silent Hill games, were Taiwanese and made a 2D point-click adventure game. But even that simple description sells short the absolute psychological horror magic that this game won me over with. The same passion for unsettling atmosphere, emotional storytelling, and grim dark artistry that made Silent Hill in its prime such a revered staple in horror gaming is here in Detention, and it's something that the fine folks over at Red Candle Games should be proud of. I'm someone who's not super easy to please when it comes to horror games. Many horror games are cursed with the same Sturgeon's law that horror movies and arguably just any form of media are cursed with, a sea of utter garbage you have to swim through just to get to the works that really matter and are worth your time. Detention, for the short 2 to 3 hours it gives you, doesn't waste any of your time and gives you one of the best psychological horror games I've personally played in years. Normally I'd start with a basic plot synopsis, but this is a game that really benefits with you going into it, knowing as little as possible. And being that this is an incredibly short game that only lasts about 2 to 3 hours, all the footage you'll see will only show gameplay from about the first hour or so. For that reason, I'm going to skip the synopsis and instead talk about what this game gets right in its basic gameplay, art design, and how it invokes dread. All I will say about the story is that it's a treat to unravel. It's a grim, tragic story of the multifaceted and interesting main character and her struggle to accept a great misdeed she had committed. And all the dark and surreal imagery in the game, in one way or another, symbolizes her internal struggle. It had me hooked, to say the least, and there's 2 possible endings for the game, which gives it some replay value to boot. And I'll admit, I don't know as much about Taiwanese or Chinese mythology as I do Greek or Egyptian mythology, but the story is strongly influenced by Taiwanese mythology and makes several nods to many of its creatures and legends. So it's kind of cool too that this game actually got me to do a little bit of research on a culture I never really thought much of before and learned some cool things. I experienced the same thing earlier this year for Norse mythology with the new God of War. Anyways, gameplay is actually very standard basic point-click adventure fare. You drag the mouse across the screen, click where you want your character to go, click on what you want to examine, pick up items, solve some puzzles, find bits and pieces of the lore strewn about the game world in the form of notes. Nothing really innovative. The one thing that does distinguish this game from most other point-click adventure games is that there is enemies and you do have to avoid them. Yes, it's another horror game where you can't fight back, but it's really not that big of a deal. Encounters are very few and far between, and they're not a dynamic threat that hunts you down like the Scissor Man in the Clock Tower games, as they stay in one designated area and don't follow you into rooms, and you can completely walk past them by holding your breath. These enemies are called the Lingered. They're based off of malevolent specters in Chinese and Taiwanese mythology called the Wang Liang, who eat living humans. And by clicking the right mouse pad, you can hold your breath and sneak by the Lingered undetected. But the 2 downsides to this is not only do you move incredibly slowly, but you also can't hold your breath forever. This leads to some super tense moments where an enemy will be patrolling its designated area and you'll be trailing it slowly, hoping it'll turn around so you can walk past it without running out of breath. If you are seen by them, it's as simple as running away from them and going into another room to reset them. If you are killed by one, you walk up a short hill in what can presume to be purgatory to get another chance at the last shrine that you saved at. Which, for how small scale the game is, it's really not that big of a hassle to regain progress. I kind of wish there was a far bigger punishment for getting killed in this game, besides walking up this hill every time, which essentially just constitutes as a 10-second interactive loading screen. Or at the very least have limited saves like in the old Resident Evil games, because as is, I think the game is a little too easy, which also probably contributes to how short this game is. Another small complaint that's not so much a complaint as it is a minor disappointment. Early on in the game, there's a hallway with 2 doors. One on the other side of the hall with one of the Lingered blocking it, and a door on the wall right beside you as you enter. Since the enemy is blocking the door, you go into the room and find not only the key for said door at the end of the hallway, but an item to distract the enemy so you can get to the door unnoticed. A bowl of rice that you can set on the ground and will get the enemy to come over and eat it. This got me really excited as I thought of all the creative and heart-pounding situations that you could conjure with this mechanic. Turns out though, you never do this again outside of this one room. If there is a sequel to this game, I wouldn't mind having a bigger focus on interactive enemies that you need to overcome in creative ways with the game's mechanics, like a rice bowl that can distract enemies. As is, I think the enemy encounters are somewhat undercooked. The enemies themselves are very creepy, but they're not incredibly threatening, and there's very little to them besides holding your breath and walking past them. But I'm actually glad that enemy encounters aren't a big focus in the game. It's not what you play this kind of game for. Being that this is a Silent Hill influenced psychological horror adventure game, the one prominent gameplay element that merges time and time again is puzzles. The bulk of the game is traversing these small yet complex environments, looking for items to solve logic-based puzzles, but being that this is a psychological horror game, some of the puzzles run on pretty fucked up logic. Again, for the sake of keeping the game a surprise to new players, I won't give a bunch of specific examples, but these are creative, well-crafted puzzles that aren't brainbusters, but they aren't super obvious out of the gate either, and make more and more sense once you've gathered all the necessary tools to solve it, giving a very satisfying eureka moment when you've assembled the entire picture in your head. The Silent Hill influence in the puzzles is very apparent, as mundane objects like dice and hand puppets are used to solve many of these bizarre and twisted puzzles. My favorite kind of puzzles. There even is a piano puzzle invoking the one in the original Silent Hill, where you have to play back a song that plays on an 8-track player by memory, and some of the keys are broken, so you have to mess around a bit to figure out which key makes which tone and play the melody accordingly. But you feel like a genius when you finally figure it out. And on top of being cognitively stimulating, these puzzles are wonderfully presented in deliciously dark splendor. In fact, I can't believe it took me this long to mention it in the video, but I absolutely love this game's visual aesthetic. Each area of the game is small and compact, more so than even Silent Hill due to it being 2D, but they're dense with rich detail and artistry. The art style itself at times resembles a grainy black and white photo that fits with the era that this game takes place in, but that doesn't mean the game is boring or monochromatic to look at. In fact, when the game does boldly use colors, the atmosphere is on a whole other level and leads to some of the most impressively surreal imagery I've seen in a horror game of this type. It's trippy, surreal, psychological horror goodness that I can't get enough of. The animation on the characters themselves is a bit choppy, but that's only a small blemish on an otherwise excellent visual feast of horror. And in the case of The Lingered, it adds an uncanny valley creep factor that only makes the game more effectively creepy and unsettling. And what's a horror game without a creepy, ambient soundtrack to boot? And Detention has a creepy, oppressive soundtrack of dark, underlying drones and clattering noise, with the occasional beautifully serene guitar piece to hold it all together. I really hate to keep making allusions to Silent Hill, especially in this fucked up age of games journalism, but it invokes the absolute best of Akira Yamaoka's famous musical work on the Silent Hill series, and it fits the game perfectly, and the sound design is even better. Great sound design arguably adds even more to an effective horror experience than even the soundtrack itself, and Detention has some really good sound design. The sound of your lonely footsteps, the unnerving laughter of the lingered, the creaking you'll occasionally hear from this old rustic school you spend a good chunk of the game exploring, and the disgusting sounds of body parts contorting and twisting. It's some messed up stuff, man. Well, there you have it. An excellent point-and-click adventure game that doesn't overstay its welcome, tells a haunting and tragic tale of a flawed main protagonist with poignant imagery and symbolism, has puzzles that make you think but don't tax your brain too much, and don't get in the way of some of the most splendid, mind-bending horror I've played in a game in forever. Really, other than the game being too easy and arguably too short, which normally I would agree with, but I think horror games are one of the few types of games that strongly benefit from shorter playtimes, but that's getting off topic and definitely something I'll have to make a video on someday. There's really not much I can fault Detention for. And the game is $12 on Steam, but the game is frequently on sale, so you can often get it for less. You have no excuse to not try it. So I say for this Halloween, treat yourself to an excellent Taiwanese horror experience. It's the closest thing to a new Silent Hill game we're going to get anytime soon, since Konami apparently hates making money and loves alienating their longtime fans.